This week, the sheriff leading the investigation sat down with a national magazine and said something that no one, in 104 days of press conferences and press releases and carefully worded public statements, had ever said out loud before. He is no longer talking to the Guthrie family, not pulling back slightly, not communicating less frequently, no longer talking to them directly at all. The FBI is now handling all communication between the investigation and the family of the missing woman at the center of it. Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, Cameron Guthrie, the children who have spent 104 days living this. They are not taking calls from the sheriff anymore. They are only talking to the FBI. That is the headline from Sheriff Chris Nanos's People magazine interview this week. But it is not the only headline, because in that same interview, Nanos said something else. Two words that no law enforcement official in this case has ever said publicly before. Two words that tell you, more honestly than anything else said in the last 104 days, exactly how much is riding on what happens next in a laboratory in San Francisco and a building in Quantico, Virginia. Cold case. He said cold case, out loud, to a national magazine, for the first time. This video is going to go through that People magazine interview piece by piece, section by section, with the same level of analytical attention that Brian Entin and former investigator Morgan Wright applied when they broke it down on Brian Entin Investigates this week. Every new detail, every implication, everything Nanos said and everything he did not say. By the end of this video, you will have the clearest picture of where this investigation actually stands on day 104 that has been assembled in one place. Subscribe to Deep Discovered, hit the notification bell, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now, let us go through it. Deep W on WH Oz Morgan Wright and why his analysis matters. Before we get into what the People magazine interview said, I want to spend a moment on Morgan Wright, because his assessment carries more weight than most of the expert commentary this case has generated, and the audience deserves to understand why. Morgan Wright is the CEO and founder of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases. He spent 18 years as a state trooper and investigator, working in both state and local law enforcement. He is an internationally recognized expert on law enforcement, national security, and intelligence. He is not a television commentator with a law enforcement background. He is a practitioner, someone who has worked cases, built evidence, interviewed suspects, and understood how investigations actually function from the inside. When he sat down with Brian Entin this week to go through the Nanos interview, he was not speculating. He was applying 40 years of professional experience to a set of public statements made by a sheriff whose investigation he has been watching carefully. That context matters for everything that follows. The family has stopped talking to the sheriff. Let us start with what Brian Entin described as the single detail that stopped him in his tracks. Sheriff Chris Nanos told People magazine that he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family. He said those conversations are now being handled by the FBI. His exact words, "I personally am not," when asked whether he remained in direct touch with the family, adding that detectives and federal agents now handle all contact. Think about what that means in an active investigation. The sheriff who stood at those early press conferences and told the world his team was going to solve this. The man who in the early weeks was texting and calling Savannah Guthrie directly, updating her personally, acting as both the operational lead and the public face of the search. That relationship is over. The family is only talking to the FBI. Morgan Wright said it plainly. In his entire career, over 40 years, it is unusual for the originating agency to not be in communication with the victim's family. Unusual, not unprecedented, unusual. The originating agency is the agency with investigative authority. In this case, that is the Pima County Sheriff's Office, and they are not talking to the Guthries. The FBI is. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin-Daffer went on News Nation and asked the question everyone should be asking: was it the family or the sheriff who cut off communication first? She said it plainly: "I just think this shows a confidence in the family to deal with the FBI and not with the Pima County Sheriff, under the cloud that he unfortunately is operating with this investigation." Under the cloud. That is the phrase, and the cloud is specific, documented, and growing. Two explanations. Both might be true. Morgan Wright laid out the two possible explanations for why the FBI is now the sole communication channel between law enforcement and the Guthrie family. The first is optimistic. Something significant is happening behind the scenes, something in an advanced stage that falls clearly within the FBI's lane. A hostage negotiation, an advanced intelligence operation, a forensic development that requires federal handling at a level that makes it appropriate and logical for the FBI to be the point of contact. If this is the explanation, the communication shift is a sign of progress. The second is sobering. The relationship between the sheriff and the Guthrie family has broken down to the point where the FBI has stepped in to manage it, not because a breakthrough is imminent, but because the trust between the family and Nanos has eroded past the point of functional communication. Morgan Wright said both of those things might be true simultaneously, and I think that is the most honest assessment of where things stand. The family may have lost faith in Chris Nanos, and a breakthrough may be approaching. Those are not mutually exclusive, both can be true at the same time. But here is the practical consequence that Morgan Wright raised that goes beyond the investigation itself. He said when you are working a major case, you always want to maintain contact with the family, always, because at some point you are going to need them. When the case gets built, when it goes to trial, you need their cooperation, you need their testimony, you need them on your side. If you have spent 104 days allowing the relationship to deteriorate to the point where the family will only talk to the federal agency and not to you, you have created a problem for yourself that extends into the prosecution of this case, whenever that prosecution comes. Nanos admits the family is frustrated, first time publicly, and then Nanos said something else in that People magazine interview that I want to sit with for a moment, because it is the kind of thing that gets reported as a minor detail and is actually anything but. He said the public is frustrated. He said even the Guthrie family is frustrated. He said that out loud to a national magazine. The sheriff who has been leading this investigation officially acknowledged publicly for the first time that the family of the missing woman is frustrated with the process he is leading. How could they not be? Their mother, their grandmother, has been gone for 104 days. No arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed proof of life, and the sheriff is still saying, "We are getting closer. We believe in the process. The best minds in the country are working on this." But the fact that he is now publicly acknowledging the family's frustration while simultaneously confirming he is no longer talking to them directly, those two things together tell you something about the state of this relationship that 104 days of press conferences never once said out loud. The sheriff is technically in charge. The FBI is actually running things, and the Guthrie family knows it. They have voted with their silence toward Nanos, and Nanos, to his credit, acknowledged it in print. The DNA, the optimism, the cold case warning. Now let us get to the DNA, because Nanos said something in that People magazine interview that is simultaneously the most optimistic and the most alarming statement he has made publicly since this investigation began. Here is the direct quote. He said, "I know we have DNA that is unknown who the contributor or depositor is, but I think they are getting closer to finding out who that was. I have confidence in our labs. When the labs tell us there is nothing else they can do, well, then maybe we have got a problem. We have got a cold case. But right now the labs are not telling us that." Let me break that into two halves because each half tells a different story. The optimistic half, getting closer. That is the first time Nanos has used that specific phrase in the specific context of DNA identification rather than just the investigation generally. And Morgan Wright, who has spent decades understanding how these investigations work, decoded that phrase directly. He said, when the sheriff says getting closer, the analysis is probably already done. What the labs are likely doing now is the genealogy work, building family trees from partial DNA matches, working outward from second and third cousin connections in public databases, narrowing the pool of candidates. That process, Wright said, takes anywhere from 60 to 90 days just to develop a solid picture of the landscape. Who is related to whom, where the family trees branch, where they converge. The hair sample was transferred to Quantico and Estrella Forensics in mid-April. 60 to 90 days from mid-April puts the potential result window at mid-June to mid-July. We may be weeks away from a development. That is the optimistic half. Now the alarming half. Cold case. Chris Nanos, the sheriff of Pima County, the man technically in charge of finding Nancy Guthrie, used those two words publicly for the first time. He framed it conditionally. If the labs say there is nothing more they can do, but he said it. And Brian Entin, who has been closer to this investigation than almost any journalist in the country, noted that his sources inside the investigation have been saying the same thing privately for weeks. They are waiting on the DNA. If it does not produce something usable, there is not much else to go on. No solid suspect, no dominant lead, essentially waiting on the lab. Everything riding on a strand of hair sitting in a laboratory in San Francisco. The contamination risk, the gloves, the honest caveat. But Morgan Wright added a layer of context here that I think everyone following this case needs to hear, because it adds an important asterisk to the optimism about the DNA. He said, DNA does not come with a date and a timestamp. You do not know when that hair was deposited. You do not know under what circumstances. And Sergeant Aaron Cross, who served as the Pima County Sheriff's public information officer in the early days of this investigation, described that first week on the scene as chaotic. Chaotic. That word matters enormously in a forensic context. A chaotic first week at a crime scene means the possibility of contamination. It means the DNA found inside Nancy Guthrie's home may not have been introduced by the perpetrator. It may have been introduced by someone who had legitimate access to the property in the days surrounding the disappearance. A family member, a friend, a neighbor, a first responder who entered without full protective measures. And if the genetic genealogy work produces a name from that DNA, that name still has to be placed in context, still has to be corroborated by other evidence, still has to survive the challenge that any competent defense attorney would raise in a courtroom before it becomes a conviction. And on the gloves. The black gloves found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home in February, the ones that generated enormous public attention and briefly looked like a breakthrough. Morgan Wright addressed those directly. He called them, in his words, a nothing burger, because DNA found on a surface that was never definitively connected to the crime scene is meaningless without that connection. You cannot build a case on DNA from an object you cannot place at the scene. The gloves remained an unconfirmed lead. They are still unconfirmed. That is the honest state of the physical evidence. The vehicle theory. The most important new analysis in this case. Now I want to spend significant time on something Morgan Wright said this week that I think represents the most genuinely new analytical framework applied to this case in months. And once you hear it, you will never look at the doorbell footage the same way again. For 104 days, the central debate about the figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch has been one question: was he trying to hide his face? The mask is there. The mask does the job. So why spend that much time with the camera? Why fumble with vegetation? Why hold a flashlight in your mouth while you cover a lens? The face is already hidden. Morgan Wright looked at that footage and said the question is wrong. The guy at the door was not worried about being identified. He was not worried about being seen. He was worried about something else entirely. He was worried about the vehicle. Here is the logic. Morgan Wright spent 18 years as a state trooper. He described working a fatality accident where the only evidence was a small piece of the vehicle's grille. From that single fragment, just a small piece of painted metal, investigators were able to extract the year, the make, the model, and a partial VIN number. They tracked down the vehicle, one small piece, because a vehicle is traceable in a way that a masked face fundamentally is not. A vehicle has a make, a model, a year, a color, a partial license plate number, a distinctive feature that a camera might catch, a broken taillight, a specific wheel, a dent, a bumper sticker, that law enforcement can run through a DMV database and trace to a registered owner within 24 hours. A masked face gives you nothing. A vehicle gives you an address. So think about what the person on Nancy Guthrie's porch knew. He knew his face was hidden. He knew his body was covered, but there was a vehicle somewhere nearby. The vehicle that brought him there, the vehicle that would take Nancy away, the vehicle that was the single most identifiable and most traceable element of the entire operation. And if that doorbell camera had been recording to the cloud when the vehicle was visible, law enforcement would have had footage of it within hours of the crime being discovered. Morgan Wright's conclusion is this: the figure was not covering the camera to hide himself, he was covering it to hide the car. And then Morgan Wright pointed to the blood. He said, "Look at where the blood trail goes. Look at where it stops. It stops at the curb, at the exact place where a vehicle would have to have been positioned for Nancy to be loaded into it. That is not a theory, that is physics. That is the physical record of what happened in the early hours of February 1st. She was carried to a car. The blood stopped where the car was. The car drove away. And the person who covered that camera understood before he ever arrived at that house that if the camera captured the car would lead investigators home. That level of operational thinking, specifically planning around vehicle identification, tells you something important about whoever planned this operation. Whether that person is the figure on the porch or someone who briefed the figure on the porch, the knowledge that a vehicle is more traceable than a face is not knowledge that comes from watching crime dramas. That comes from experience with or specific research into how law enforcement investigations actually work. The video catalog, the inverted approach, the egress map. Now let us talk about the thousands of videos, because Nanos addressed this directly in the People magazine interview, and Morgan Wright's response to it is one of the most practically useful things said about this investigation in weeks. Nanos said there are thousands and thousands of videos from intersections and ring cameras that investigators have to catalog. He described the approach as building a library, sorting vehicles by type and color so that when a suspect is eventually identified, investigators can go back and cross-reference. All the white trucks over here, all the red sedans over there. Morgan Wright said that approach is inverted, and when he explained why, I understood immediately why it matters. He said, you already know something crucial. You know the approximate window when Nancy was taken. Her pacemaker stopped syncing with her phone at 2:28 in the morning. That is your anchor. Based on the accelerometer data, she was in motion somewhere between 2:12 and 2:28. That is your window. Instead of cataloging every vehicle that has ever appeared on every camera and waiting for a suspect name to cross-reference against, flip it. Take the 2:12 to 2:28 window. Pull every vehicle that was in motion within a reasonable radius of Nancy's home during that specific window. That is a dramatically smaller universe than every vehicle ever captured on every camera in Tucson. He called this egress analysis. You look at the routes out, the road south toward Interstate 19, the corridor toward Nogales, the approaches toward the border. You look at what vehicles were moving through those corridors in that window, and you eliminate. Wrong direction, wrong size, wrong timeline. You keep eliminating until you have a manageable subset of vehicles that genuinely warrant investigation. And then, Wright said something that stopped me. He said if any of those vehicles also appear at a border crossing within a plausible time frame, that connection becomes significant. If someone drove from Nancy's house to the Nogales crossing, the minimum drive time matters. You could not make that crossing in 15 minutes, but an hour and a half to 2 hours later, plausible, especially with a stopping point somewhere along the route. So you cross-reference vehicles in your egress window against vehicles that crossed the border in the appropriate time frame. Look for overlap. That is not speculation. That is logistics. That is physics. And it is the kind of work that narrows a search from hundreds of thousands of videos to a handful of genuine candidates. Morgan Wright said he actually did this analysis personally. He built an egress map of the Catalina foothills showing the routes out and the time constraints on each one. The vehicle theory and the egress analysis are connected. The car was important enough that the operative spent time on that porch making sure no camera captured it, and a car that was important enough to hide may already be traceable through the right combination of the pacemaker timestamp, the egress routes, and border crossing records, if investigators are looking in the right direction. Nanos confirmed to Newsweek that a vehicle was in fact captured on a ring camera approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home around the time of the pacemaker sync. He said investigators are looking at that vehicle, as well as hundreds of thousands of others. Morgan Wright would say, stop looking at hundreds of thousands and start with the timestamp. That is your filter. Everything else follows. Burglary versus kidnapping. Incompatible mindsets. Brian Entin asked Morgan Wright the question that has divided expert opinion since day one. Was this a burglary gone wrong or a targeted abduction? Morgan Wright's answer was about as definitive as I have heard from anyone with his level of experience. He said there is very little, if anything, to indicate it was a burglary gone wrong. The reasoning is not just intuition, it is behavioral science. A burglary and a kidnapping require completely different skill sets and completely different operational mindsets. A burglary is about acquisition. You go in, you take things, you leave. The last thing you want is contact with anyone inside the property, because contact means complications, witnesses, resistance, noise. A kidnapping is the opposite. Kidnapping is about control. It requires planning for the physical management of another person from the moment of entry. It requires planning for transport, for containment, for the situation you will be in after you leave the house with someone who does not want to come with you. You cannot slide from burglary mode into kidnapping mode mid-operation. Those are not compatible states of mind. You do not walk into a house planning to steal things and walk out with an 84-year-old woman unless you came in specifically intending to take her. The planning required for what happened on February 1st is inconsistent with any accidental or opportunistic version of this crime. This was targeted. This was planned. This was executed against a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. Nobody. Homicide. The hardest thing anyone has said. And then Morgan Wright said the thing that I think is the most significant analytical statement made about this case in over 100 days. He said, "This is a no-body homicide, not a missing persons case, not a kidnapping for ransom, a no-body homicide," which means he believes Nancy Guthrie is no longer alive and that the investigation should be working from that premise. He listed the reasons: her age, her cardiac condition, the violence of the confrontation at 2 a.m. in her own home, the blood on the porch, the medication left on the counter that she could not survive missing for more than a day or two, the ransom notes that went to TMZ rather than to the family through a private channel, the Bitcoin wallet that has never been touched by anyone. All of it, in Wright's assessment, points not to someone being held somewhere waiting to be ransomed, but to a crime that was completed on the night it began. I want to be careful here. Law enforcement has not publicly declared Nancy dead. The Guthrie family has not declared Nancy dead. And there are people, including Elizabeth Smart, who survived 9 months of captivity when every expert said the outcome was almost certainly fatal, who have said publicly that Nancy could absolutely still be alive. That counterpoint deserves to be heard and respected. Morgan Wright acknowledged it. He was not dismissive of it. But here is why his framing matters beyond the question of whether Nancy is alive. He said, treating this as a no-body homicide changes what investigators are looking for and where they are looking for it. If you are searching for a missing person, you are looking for someone alive, in a building, in a vehicle, across a border. If you are working a no-body homicide, you are looking for clandestine grave sites, open grave sites, concealed areas in the foothills where something was buried or left. You are asking the people walking through the desert to look differently at what is around them. That shift in what you are looking for and where is what Wright was advocating, not a declaration of death, a change in the investigative framework that produces different searches in different places. And that shift, quiet as it may already be underway. The fact that the FBI is now handling all family communications directly may not be coincidence. One person or two. The silence of the reward. Now the question that has divided expert opinion since the beginning. One person or two. The two-person theory has credible support. The logistics of taking an 84-year-old woman against her will, transporting her, managing her physical resistance, those require more than one person. The rear floodlights were reportedly smashed at the same time the front camera was being covered. 2 simultaneous points of action, 2 roles. Retired Detective Bob Gilliam and former Homicide Sergeant John Lamb have both said publicly they believe at least 2 people were involved, with Lamb speculating a third person may have been waiting in the transport vehicle as a lookout. The physical evidence is consistent with that theory, but Morgan Wright raised something this week that genuinely challenges it, and it connects directly to the most powerful piece of evidence in this entire case that nobody physically collected: the silence of the reward. He said 2 people cannot keep a secret. A secret can only be kept by one person. There is $1,200,000 sitting on the table unclaimed for 104 days. If two people are involved, one of them should have cracked by now. That is not an opinion. That is the math applied to human behavior under pressure. Every expert who has addressed this question, Steve Moore, Marian O'Connell, Morgan Wright, arrives at the same conclusion. Two people under this much scrutiny, with this much money available, cannot both hold their nerve indefinitely. And yet nobody has called, nobody has moved on that reward. Morgan Wright said that silence is the loudest argument for a single offender that exists in this case. A lone wolf, someone carrying this alone, someone who may not even be from the Tucson area, a traveling criminal with no local footprint, no field interview cards in the Pima County system, no prior contact with local law enforcement, someone who came in, completed the operation, and left, and there is nothing organic in the system to pull them back into view. That is why, despite the footage, the backpack identification, the height and build description, there is still no suspect name, not because investigators are not working, because the person they are looking for may have left no trail in the places they are searching. The FBI tension, the $1 million county bill, the record. Nanos used the People magazine interview to push back on FBI Director Kash Patel. He said the FBI was with us from day one. He said coordination began soon after learning of Nancy's disappearance. He said Patel has his right to his opinions, but that some remarks were factually inaccurate. This is a contradiction we have covered before on this channel, but something new emerged this week that Brian Entin flagged as a detail he had not heard discussed publicly before. Dr. Matthew Hines, a Pima County supervisor, said he believes the Nancy Guthrie investigation has already cost Pima County approximately $1 million, and that had the sheriff allowed the FBI to take the DNA and manage the investigation from the beginning, the county would have saved an enormous amount of that money. The FBI investigation would have been federally funded. Instead, the county has been carrying the full financial burden of a case that has required resources far beyond what a standard sheriff's department handles, $1 million of county taxpayer money on a case that FBI Director Kash Patel said his agency was ready to handle from night one with hundreds of agents, a fixed-wing aircraft, and the most advanced forensic laboratory in the country. And the sheriff said no. Morgan Wright was measured about this. He said, not all the criticism of Nanos is fair. DNA results do not come back in 44 minutes because that is how long a television drama lasts. Mixed DNA, convoluted DNA, is genuinely difficult to analyze in a way that holds up under cross-examination in court. There is real science behind the delays that the public does not always appreciate. He was right to say that. But then he also said the record speaks for itself. And the record is specific. A Pima County Board of Supervisors that compelled the sheriff to give sworn testimony under oath, a bipartisan group of supervisors who called for his resignation, a vote he survived, a county that has spent $1 million on a case the FBI was prepared to lead from the beginning, and a Guthrie family that is no longer speaking to the sheriff at all. That is the record, and it speaks for itself. What we still do not know, and what the pacemaker knows. Let me be honest about the gaps, because an honest accounting of what we do not know is as important as what we do. We do not know where Nancy Guthrie is. We do not know if she is alive. We do not know what the DNA at Quantico and Astrea Forensics has actually produced. We do not know what happened in the 4 days that Kash Patel says the FBI was excluded from the investigation. We do not know what is on the 911 call that is sealed by investigators. We do not know why the investigation still appears to orbit around the people closest to Nancy in the hours before she disappeared, even after those people have been publicly cleared. These are not small gaps. These are the central questions, and after 104 days they remain unanswered. But here is what I will say about where this investigation stands right now. The FBI is the primary point of contact for the Guthrie family. That is not a procedural detail. When a family stops talking to the originating agency and only communicates through the federal agency, that tells you something about who has the information, who has the momentum, and who the family trusts to bring this to resolution. The FBI has the DNA at Quantico. The FBI has the resources. The FBI has the genetic genealogy expertise. The FBI has the family's trust. And on May 18th, 4 days ago, Jonathan Lee Riches, who has broken details in this case before they surfaced elsewhere, posted that his sources are saying investigators are really close to solving the Nancy Guthrie case. That claim is unverified. It has not been confirmed by law enforcement. We are treating it as what it is, an unverified claim from a source that has been right before. But combined with Nanos's own getting closer statement about the DNA, the timeline that puts the genealogy work in a potential result window in the weeks ahead, and the FBI's full operational control of this investigation, the picture is one of an investigation that has not gone cold, whatever the sheriff's conditional language suggested. The labs are still working, the genealogy is still building, the threads are still being pulled. The pacemaker, the matchbox, the clothes. Savannah Guthrie posted on Mother's Day, 100 days into the search for her mother. She wrote, "Mother, daughter, sister, Nan, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you." I cannot read that without feeling the full weight of what those words contain. A daughter who goes on television every morning and holds it together because that is what her job requires, posting privately that there is no peace, that there will be no peace until this ends. That is not a public statement. That is a person living inside the worst thing that has ever happened to them. And then there is the pacemaker, the device the size of a small matchbox implanted in Nancy Guthrie's chest, still running, still logging, still recording every electrical signal from a heart that has been beating in an unknown location since 2:28 on the morning of February 1st. Every second since that timestamp is stored in that device. Every heartbeat, every movement, every moment of everything that has happened to Nancy Guthrie from the moment her phone lost the signal to the present. That data exists. It is not gone. It is waiting. And when the investigation reaches the point where that device can be recovered, whenever that point comes, it will tell a story that no amount of legal maneuvering or silence or destroyed evidence can contradict. The pacemaker is the most honest witness in this entire case, and it has been keeping count since day one. The FBI is running this now. The DNA is at Quantico. The genealogy window may be weeks away from producing a result. The reward remains at $1,200,000, unclaimed, waiting for the person who connects one detail to one other detail and makes the call. If you have any information, any detail about a vehicle, a behavior, a conversation, a person whose routine changed in early February, the FBI needs to hear from you. tips.fbi.gov, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Completely anonymous, no arrest required, no conviction required. A tip that leads to Nancy is enough. Leave a comment. Tell me which revelation from this week's analysis hit you the hardest. Tell me what you think the silence of that reward means, one person or two. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if you are new to Deep Discovered, we do not chase headlines. We sit inside these cases. We follow every thread. We come back when things change. And in this case, things changed this week in ways that matter. I will see you in the next update. Deep Discovered.